Hello, everyone. Welcome to our fifth session in the series dedicated to the Soviet art of the post-war period. Every time I try to feed as much information as possible into this hour and a half, and every time we talk about two artists. Today I have a lot of material again, and both of the artists we're going to talk about tonight are actually worth a whole talk, a separate talk. But actually, it also makes sense to discuss two destinies, two lives, two biographies in one session, comparing them. I think it is interesting because these life journeys actually mirror each other. Today, we're going to talk about Francisco and Infante and Viacheslav Koleychuk, and I have juxtaposed their functions in contemporary art in the title of my talk, A Visionary and an Engineer. These are artists who were really ahead of their time for different reasons, and we will try to go into them tonight. Finally, they managed to break through into the international art scene. Unlike many others contemporary artists, both Infante and Koleychuk were not completely banned, even when they were working in the Soviet Union. They were represented in the official culture too. Our today's narrative will have a lot of challenges and contradictions. Creative biographies of these two artists start with a so-called movement group that today causes a lot of heated arguments. These arguments are due to the conflict between Infante Koleychuk and one of the participants of this collective, Lev Nusberg. And indeed, Lev Nusberg's role cannot be overestimated. One might call him the main driving force of the collective, at least at the beginning. He gathered around him young artists who find themselves limited in the official Soviet art scene. But later on, unfortunately, their paths parted ways, and we have to take that into account too in our narrative. The movement group, at its beginning from 62 to 68, at its early stages, was not a collective. The participants of this group did not do any collective artworks. Every one of them worked individually. They were a collective in a sense of being friends and exchanging ideas. Later on, Lev Nusberg tried to take over the mission of the collective, calling it his group later on, although it was far from being so. So Lev Nusberg was a very young man, back then a student of the last year of the Moscow Art School, which we mentioned at the previous talks, found himself at the Picasso exhibition, which completely changed his perception of art and himself as an artist. He says in his memoirs that ever since then, he started to Picasso. He started to imitate Picasso's art. In 1957, during the festival, the youth festival in the Soviet Union, having seen haven't seen journals that were published in the Soviet Union on art. Lev Nusberg tried to find himself both in painting and in art. He tried to continue what he saw, he tried to reinterpret what he saw in his own way. Here is one of his works, early works, 1961, which looks abstract. And it continues some of the features of surrealism. Later on, Lev Nusberg continued his research. Here is one of his more radical works, fresco, titled The Spiritual Vertical. Here, his interpretation of contemporary art is rhymed with the Washington School, namely Kenneth Nolan. This painting that knows no boundaries could be continued eternally to the right and to the left. Lev Nusberg himself explains his use of geometry in very lengthy texts, not very clear ones too. In his memoirs, if I can call them that, in his interviews, Lev Nusberg always mentions the idea of symmetry, but it's not just a geometry term for him. It's something that describes the perfection of the universe. He tries to recreate this kind of symmetry in a number of drawings. One of them is on the screen now. He also turns to the idea of symmetry in his paintings and in his sculptures. In the early works, which are executed quite poorly, I would say, without any pretense, without any fancy aesthetics, this is orgolite of quite poor quality. And what he uses here is gouache, the cheapest drawing materials available for school children. It looks more like a mock-up or a sketch of something that was impossible for him to do. However, here already we can see that he aims to restructure geometric shapes to create dynamics of the vertical and the horizontal. This is something that the artist aimed for. He was researching the forms within the technologies that were accessible to him, no matter whether this movement is vertical or horizontal. But these works, I think, achieve the goal that he set for them. And it's obvious that the line of thought of Lev Nusberg at the beginning of the 60s goes along the optic art. Art that plays not just with forms, not only with autonomous pictorial structures, but also creates a certain environment around it and makes this environment dynamic. As for the object or the objects that I mentioned, as Valentin Vorobyov remembered, artist of the same generation, one of the enthusiasts of contemporary art, Lev Nusberg, in his room in a communal apartment, created an object which was not executed quite completely. But here is what his idea was like. Nusberg used egg packages, the same one that we buy now in supermarkets, a 3D structure with a source of light in the middle of it. The structure had to rotate and it had to emit sounds to provide the full impression that Nusberg was aiming for. So this is something that he had in mind at the beginning of the 60s. However, the most important thing about his idea was different. We can turn to one of his theoretic articles. Please pay attention to the final paragraph. I would like to work with electromagnetic fields, with pulsating plasma clots in space, with the movement of gases and liquids, with mirror and all kinds of optical effects, with temperature changes and various smells, and of course with music. So we can see that what he wants to work with goes far beyond the devices and the technologies he had at the time. What he's talking about here is a kind of synthetic totality that has to completely transform the environment that the person finds themselves in. It is about creating a full picture of a fantasy world derived not from pages of fantasy novels and not from illustrations, book illustrations. It is about immersing people into this space. The first collective that Nusberg gathered around him, because I will reiterate that Nusberg had a lot of energy. He was very charismatic. He knew how to engage others. He knew how to charm others, even those who did not know about contemporary art. So the first community around him emerged at the end of the 50s. And again, it was not an art collective. That was just a group of friends that gathered around Nusberg and that worked on their own things. The most famous participant of the community at that time is Rima Zanevskaya-Sapgir, whose works are exhibited in the Tretyakov Gallery. But those were just the beginnings. It was all about pure geometry in art and its exploration. In 1962, the first group fell apart, and Nusberg was joined by young students of the Moscow Art School. Among whom was a representative of the younger generation, Francisco Infante, Vladimir Galkin, Vladimir Stepanov, Yuri Kolpakov, and many others. And pretty much like the first group before it, they started off working with pure geometry, but in 1963, they got to know a young Czech art historian who graduated from the Moscow State University, Dušan Konečný. In the Soviet Union and in Czechia, he was researching all of the new developments in contemporary art in all of Eastern Europe. He was focused on the artists who were ready to modernize socialist realism, to switch to the truly communist art that would be the direct continuation of the Russian avant-garde. By the way, here you can see the cover of the Domov magazine, 1964, the 4th issue. Here was published Konečny's article in Czech, where he analyzed all of these young Moscow-based artists. He mentions Tatlin, Rodchenko, European and American constructivism, as well as this movement group. Dušan Konečný, like many others Eastern European art historians and curators, is trying to create an international movement. A movement that would continue the tasks and the patterns of art which were not obvious in the first decades of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union made all of those trends and movements completely obscure, screening them off from the official art scene. When we did the exhibition called Transatlantic Alternative at the Garage Museum of Contemporary Art, to our surprise, we found out that indeed, although both op art and kinetism were international movements, they were most popular exactly in the countries that lived under dictatorships or within totalitarian regimes, because that was the permissible format of the modernist art language. Op artists were active in design, urban design, interior design. Dusan Konechny, like many of his peers from Yugoslavia, Poland, Hungary, Brazil, was trying not that much to serve the government, but to somehow improve the environment that they found themselves in. Their aim was to improve the environment, the context that people lived in the post-war decades. The environment that was quite pure, was quite bleak, could be transformed through the interventions of these artists. Let's see what else influenced the development, the evolution of this art group, Nusberg and his friends. Almost in the same period, around 62, 63, we don't know the exact year, they got to know Alexei Pevsner, an amazing person. Back then, he was based in Moscow. However surprising it may sound, he was the brother of internationally famous artists, Anton Pevsner, and Naum Gabo, an American constructivist and a French sculptor. After Stalin's death, Alexei Pevsner was allowed to communicate with his relatives abroad, and they managed to send the catalogs of Naum Gabo to him. Alexei appreciated his art. He thought that he was the most talented one of all the brothers, and he even wrote a book about it, which was published in French in 1966. Young artists visited Alexei Pevsner, and they did not just listen to his stories about the avant-garde of the 20s, but they could also actually see copies of works which were nowhere to be seen in the Soviet Union, especially the famous structures by Naum Gabo, which made him internationally famous. And in the context of these circumstances, and in the context of these influences, every and each one of the artists was evolving on their own. Francisco Infante, in his texts, insisted that his life journey was very much different from Lev Nusberg's. And if we look at the works, at his heritage, we see it for ourselves. It becomes evident that every one of them had their own intentions, and they were doing their own research. Francisco Infante, as he was thinking about the sources of his interest in dynamics and geometry, in objectless art, always referred to a very important story. It is something that happened to him when he was a teenager. When he was in the countryside, he was lying in the grass, looking into the bright summer sky, and then all of a sudden, as he remembered, he had a surge of terror, of a terrifying feeling that he cannot tolerate the infinity of universe. He used to say that this idea overwhelmed him, almost killing him, because it was global, it was total, and human imagination cannot even grasp such abstract hugeness. The Soviet artistic school, of course, was far from giving him the tools that would suffice to portray the infinity of the universe. Thinking about it, reading different theories in mathematics, studying the stars and astronomy, reading on philosophy, Francisco Infante simultaneously was experimenting with drawing and painting. He was wasting lots of paints, lots of pencils. And one of the first ideas that came up in his research was his attempt to somehow represent the infinity of the universe through the following. He created a whole series of drawings dedicated to the idea of the verticality. Even here in his sketches, we can see various compositions. These compositions use horizontal lines of various lengths, and they all come together into a vertical sequence, which can be continued. It can be continued infinitely. This infinite movement can be felt as a sign of presence. Working on every one of these forms, Francisco Infante was also conceptualizing his own theory. He was trying to grasp the metaphysical knowledge, as you can see here on this sheet. The composition of the birth of the vertical is recreated here again, along with his ideas and thoughts. By the way, he was 19 at that time. Later on, he recreated the birth of the vertical in this shape. This is a board. In the middle, the white lines that you can see are also wooden pieces painted in a different color. This is a 3D object. What we see here in this project is Infante going beyond abstraction in painting and going beyond traditional media for painting, for contemporary art, at least traditional for Soviet art. It's not a drawing, it's not a painting, it's not a sculpture, it's a kind of a weird object. It is the product of a young artist pondering on the infinity of the universe. This work is expressive, it's spectacular to a certain extent. And thanks to Lev Nusberg's efforts, this work, along with some other works of the collective of free artists, was presented to public. It happened in 1963 at the club which belonged to the Red Torch plant. Some of the artists presented their objects in the framework of the exhibition. Back then, they were still stable pieces, they were not mobiles. Here you can see Francisco Infante finishing the object for the show, and this is what it looked like in the framework of the exhibition. It was presented as an element of interior design, as a screen for radiators. Back then, all one could do was to try to find a function for all of these art pieces. Leonid Talochkin, who I have mentioned many times in this series, writes in his diary that this is the only work that he remembered from the exhibition, although he didn't know the name of the author. His diaries have a drawing, a sketch of this work. Of course, this wasn't the end of it. Here is another early work by him. It is called The Soul of the Crystal. To the right, you can see a blueprint, also done in 1962. What is used here is plexiglass, and you can see that the structure is really well thought through. In the middle, there is a light source. Rather, the light source is in the podium. The structure, the plexiglass structure, is on the podium, and it looks like it is lit from the inside. It is not a cube. However, the work looks like a monolith floating glass cube. Another series by the artist that Infante worked on around the same time is the form of the spiral. He came up with different solutions. Some of the spirals are vibrating, some of them are dense, some of them are projected. This form of the eternal spiral, which in some versions of his graphic works envelopes the Earth, the globe, has its own functions. As for the technological solution, I would call it extremely elegant, although, of course, the artist did not have cutting-edge equipment or technologies. Sometimes all he used was, again, gouache and a toothbrush. And it was enough for him to create such works which look like they were done by a computer, but it's not computer modeling, it's handwork. In Francisco Infante's pieces, like in other works done by the movement group, we can see a certain totality. Totality described by Lev Nusberg. However, Francisco Infante's art stands out. His work is not about creating a new environment, glamorous, based on fantasy, spectacular. He's all about rethinking the world through the ideas of eternity and harmony. Eternity became one of the key ideas for all of his art. In 1964, Lev Nusberg organizes another exhibition of the Moscow kinetists. Konechny's article was released already at that time. young artists did not feel any resistance from the authorities at the moment. And just a reminder that 1963 and 64 in our Russian history is a transitional time from the freer time of ottepel into a harsher, censorized environment. The possibilities that were out there before 1963, the possibilities for reaching the audience, slowly, one by one, disappeared. However, the team of young kinetists does not get lost. They come up with their own exhibition and they organize it at Дзержинsk. It's the office of the district party committee, and they even used the motto by Lenin that art has to belong to the people. Using a poster with these words at the show, they presented works by constructivists, Naum Gabor's works. They were all represented as items of design. Some of them were presented as radiator screens or lampshades. The works that are presented here on the wall are not, you can't really see them clearly, but the one to the right with squares is by Infante. Geometric abstractionists, op artists, kinetists are quite free at that time, and they managed to reach audience. What works for them is coming up with the functional purpose for the objects that do not actually have any purpose, that are not purely functional. But what we have just seen is presented as an ornament for a carpet or something just as functional. This is one of the key objects by Francisco Infante, Space, Movement, Eternity, and was also presented as a lampshade at the exhibition. It features quite complex design. This is a better picture, I think. You can see a few metal frames that are interconnected. It is important that there is a core stem that they are all connected to. In the previous drawing right here, you can see that Infante does not just draw this complex structure, he also thinks through the engineering solutions for it to become dynamic, for it to move. Small engines, for example, small lamps right here at the corners. This object is dynamic, it moves, and what we see here is a big sphere. It does not look like a cube, although it's all angular. We can see here the heritage of the era of modernism connected to the technologies and to the tech approach of contemporary art, when all we seem to need here is an engine, electricity, strings, metal. However, this is not decorative art, as it was supposedly represented in the film An Office Affair, when one of the characters showed a mobile hanging in his apartment. From that, this is the art of the new era. Viacheslav Koleychuk, another artist I want to talk about today, describes this object, space, movement, eternity, I think in a very witty way. He mentions that this composition, this object, has elements that turn engineering into aesthetics. Participants of the movement collective created 3D mobile structures, but not only that, they also created so-called fantasy compositions. They created geometric shapes and fantasy landscapes of futurist cities. Of course, when they reported to the Komsomol authorities, they explained that this is not just a fantasy, far from that. This is a possible solution to practical problems like conquering the space or conquering the far north. This is the environment that in the 21st centuries is ubiquitous. It is something taken over by architecture, contemporary art. For artists of that movement, what mattered was to see the potential future in the present through the artistic devices, artistic tools that they had at their disposal. The collective published the manifesto of the Russians, kinets, as they call themselves here. They refer to Anton Pevsner's and Naum Gabor's manifesto. Here they put forward the goals of their art, and among them is transforming the visual environment of the contemporary person. It has to bring their contemporaries to a complete harmony of the mind, soul, and body. And the artists believed that kinetism was the movement that could help with that. It's the art that reached out to people. By the way, the design they came up with was quite in demand, but we will talk about it later. Now, I want to turn to other projects by Francisco Infante. This is one piece of his series, the project of reconstructing the starry sky. Stars change their configurations and come into a different constellation, which is geometric. Sometimes they come into spirals or they come into a square shape. Francisco Infante sees his mission as that of a person who is able to reconstruct, to restructure the outer material world and create a more harmonious alternative, something more perfect, something more holistic. The group, the collective, was trying to evolve, and in 1965, they held an exhibition in St. Petersburg, in Leningrad. In 1966, they had their, I think, main exhibition project at the club of the Institute of the Nuclear Energy. That was the show where they showed their most cutting-edge pieces along with classics. And that was the show where Viacheslav Koleychuk presented one of his items, one of his works. It was done together with Vladimir Galkin, titled Double Spiral. We will go back to it. Hopefully, we will have enough time for that. The main thing I want to draw your attention to is that by 1966, finally, artists managed to engineer mobile items, mobile objects. Almost all of the pieces presented at the Kurchatov Club, at the Nuclear Institute Club, embody the goals that the artists had from the beginning. In autumn 1967, Lev Nusberg, along with the renewed group, enters a new era. Back in 1966, Nusberg signed a contract with the Leningrad City Council. He had to suggest the design for all the main squares all around St. Petersburg to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Great October Revolution. He had to design engineering solutions, and simultaneously he built the group called Dynamics, another group based now in St. Petersburg. And this is a critical point for the evolution of this group. Since 1962 till 1967, the group was quite successful, the movement group. But after 1967, the group falls apart because many of its members disagree with the aggressive tactics of Nusberg. Nusberg is turning more and more into a dictator, but he is joined by younger artists. So if we call it a group, it becomes a group indeed only in 1967. Because here at the end of the 60s, many of the works are initiated by Nusberg and are executed collectively. So the new group comes up with design solutions for the Palace Square, for the Finland Station Square, for the University Embankment. Sorry. And by the way, it has to be said that many people that were close to Nusberg, that supported the progressive trend in contemporary art that he was trying to embody, could not actually agree with the fact that he uses his talent to decorate an ideological celebration of the Soviet government. So Nusberg was starting to play along the ideological rules of the Communist Party. And that was the party that completely controlled the art scene. A crisis comes up in Nusberg's art. What we see now on the screen is a piece that is kept in our archive, titled Scenario Script for the Kinetic Performers, the Red and the White. So the script goes as following: a red army soldier and a noble woman meet each other, and what you see on the screen is the background that had to be used in the set design. Here is the whole script. We can see, for example, Vladimir Lenin's portrait projected on the stage. So, in other words, evidently it was important for Nusberg to be in demand, to claim the attention of the government that could give him a lot of material resources for him implementing his works. And he didn't seem to be too discreet about the ideological side of the matter. He thought it was okay to go against the grain of the taboos that intelligentsia had back then. Whether it's good or bad, but Nusberg failed to get all of these resources, and pretty much like many other artists of that time, the only access to public, the only access to audience, both for Galkin, Stepanov, and for Nusberg himself, as well as for Infante and Koleychuk, is designing industrial exhibitions that take place both in the USSR and beyond. Francisco Infante, for example, together with Nona Gorinova, his wife, and an engineering team, created the structure titled Galaxy that you see on your screens now. Sorry, don't have the slide. It was located at the entrance group at VDNH in Moscow. The structure is again executed with metal elements and metal strings. These are the elements that we saw at the shows of 63-64, lighting, different elements that set the structure into motion. Lev Nusberg had to work at another commission in 1969. He had to design the exhibition that commemorated 50 years anniversary of the Soviet circus. Here you can see the objects done according to the sketches of Nusberg and other members of the group. The structures became the background for all of the exhibits dedicated to the history of the Soviet circus. Also, he worked at industrial exhibitions. As I said before, for example, this exhibition, Construction Materials 71, Electros 72, or the exhibition in Montreal, an international one, designed by Stepanov and Galkin. What is curious here is that the former friends and participants of the same collective later on quarreled a lot about who these ideas belong to. When in 2016, we contacted Nusberg with the idea to recreate the object titled The Flower, which existed as a mobile, as a moving structure. And in this slide, you can see it with an engine on the university embankment, but Nusberg answered that he's not an engineer, so he was unable to recreate this object, and the engineer that worked on it cannot help anymore. He didn't even have his contacts. So for Nusberg, engineering was not really important for art. He disregarded these skills. What was most important for him was being a visionary, and all of the practical issues were delegated to anonymous engineers. Francisco Infante works in a completely different way. Together with Nonna Gorinova and Valery Osipov, an engineer, they create the Argo group. And in this picture, you can see Nonna Gorinova installing the structure sound and light that was exhibited at Chemistry 70, another industrial exhibition. Here in the blueprint, you can see the structure that includes every element of this huge object that has to rotate. Everything is meticulously calculated, including every millimeter, including every drive and every nut. Another important thing related to the history of kinetism in the Soviet Union was not only about breaking through the ideas of aesthetics, the ideas of beauty of that time. Nonconformists did painting, graphics, sculpture for the most part, while the movement group created something radically different from what professional art was thought to be back then. Kinetists used another tool, another instrument, which was used in the Soviet landscape for the first time. Here I mean performance. They were the first group to do performance art. Here you can see the first performance of the series, 1968. Young artists from Nusberg's group here in colorful onesies perform a kind of a pantomime against the backdrop of mountains and the sea. This is documented with color film, amateur footage with 8mm film, and as far as I know, unfortunately, it has not survived till today. We can see the escape from the institutional field into the nature, which is not subject to censorship at all, and it opens a new page in the history of Soviet contemporary art. We can see a completely new radical gesture, which is used here as a legitimate element of art production. Around the same time, Francisco Infante, together with his wife, having purchased their first camera after the wedding, and almost completely having cut any ties with Nusberg's group, do something that Infante and Gorinova call spontaneous games out in the nature. You can see the two of them acting out different situations. And it's not only about literally playing out in the nature. You can see them using a lot of paraphernalia. They're using different objects to transform the environment they find themselves in. And ever since that moment, Infante's journey started. A new part of the journey started. Another step on this way was his series Games in Suprematism. Looks like a very simple solution. He takes pieces of plywood of different shapes and paints them in different colors. This is photo taking of these pieces of plywood lying on the snow. Like this is a materialized Malevich's composition that fell from the space onto the earth. It means a pure aesthetic form copied from Malevich's works. Before Francisco Infante, nobody did something of the kind. Ever since 1968, he does stagings, but later on in the 80s, he started calling performance with installations out in the nature. I am afraid that back in 1968, contemporary artists did not have such terms at their disposal. And Infante takes another radical step for that time. He uses a technology that was thought back then to be purely functional. He starts to use photography as art. For him, it becomes one of the key tools he uses. He creates objects first. In this case, he takes plywood and paints it. And the second act is a performance when he places this plywood on the snow. And the third stage is shooting the scene, which brings about the result, the print, the photo print. The photo print is considered to be the end product of this project. Let's go back to Nusberg for a second. In 1976, Nusberg leaves the Soviet Union in the hope of getting more resources in Europe. But getting ahead of myself, I'll just say that he did not find what he was looking for there either. I wanted to show this cover of the exhibition that Nusberg organized in 1979 at Bochum, at the local museum. He painted this composition for the poster. Here you can see curves, which are characteristic of many of his works. And another thing that we see here is his cyber creature. That had to be born later on in his art. And we can see this creature looming over Malevich's suprematist composition. This was a statement about a new era, a new stage in contemporary art where robots, artificial intelligence, and other products of cybernetics were going to win over utopian avant-garde. So far, none of the ideas of Lev Nusberg or any of his colleagues that were also part of the movement was completely brought to life, and it seems that no artificial intelligence is able to come with what they designed back then. As for Francisco Infante, he stays in the Soviet Union, although he also had a chance to leave. I might have forgotten to say at the beginning that Francisco Infante is called this way, which is quite exotic for Russia because he was born to the family that came to the Soviet Union at the end of 30s, running from the regime of Franco. In the Soviet Union, his father met a beautiful Russian woman that he married, but soon, unfortunately, he died. So Francisco Infante was raised not in Moscow, in a village, in a Russian village, was baptized when he was a child, played football with other boys, and it felt like he never had his Spanish heritage. In the 70s, he remained in the Soviet Union. He continued working with the same structure that he first came across in his pragmatist games in the nature. But in 76 or 75, he finds perfect materials for his work. Namely, this is foil, which is quite dense, and it can be placed on metal structures. Using iron, he made it immaculately shiny and smooth. He used just that to create unimaginable things, monumental geometric shapes, which look out of place in art, in industries. Infante places these objects in different environments, sometimes uses imaginary characters too in the image. These shapes are placed against the background of snow, grass, sun, and these objects are transformed themselves just as they transform the environment around them. This seems to continue the conversation about art embodying the ideas that are unthinkable in reality. Like one cannot imagine the infinity of the universe, one can just accept it or design it, think about it, but it is impossible to experience this fact, to experience metaphysics of this fact, just like it's impossible to experience the presence of the God. All that the artist can do is to embody miracles in the space. Since then, Francisco Infante started to call these cycles artifacts, and he wrote a text about Moscow. He's mentioned in a text written by Boris Groys in the 70s. Boris Groys, in his text on Moscow conceptualism, compares Infante's work, the Collective Actions Group, Chukov's works, and he sees something in common there, extracting meaning from impossible structures, where it's not the logics that rules the world, but we see the presence of the otherworldly forces. Vyacheslav Koleychuk joins the kinetists in 1966. As I said before, he had just graduated from the Architecture Institute, and he is inspired by the achievements of the American architecture. And as he used to remember, he started to experiment with after he saw Fuller's famous pavilion that he saw at the American exhibition of 1959. He joined the team that gathered around Nusberg, and he has a lot of ideas of his own early on. These ideas are not so much about constructing impossible objects, they are rather about thinking about the effects that technologies and engineering can bring. The first object that they create in the movement group together with Vladimir Galkin is exactly this spiral. As Vyacheslav Fomich remembered, it was executed in completely unthinkable circumstances. They used just a kitchen oven. It was completely unsafe. They melted glass literally in the kitchen and connected the glass pieces with metal spikes. It all came together into a double spiral, which produced an unbelievable optic effect. In 1967, together with his wife Marina and an engineer Gennady Rykunov, they worked on a construction which was commissioned by the Kurchatov Institute of the Nuclear Energy. The point of this structure, which was dedicated, seems to be to the 50th anniversary of the October Revolution, was that it had to be presented on the Kurchatov Square in 1967. The most important thing was that all the modules that come together into this sphere, and the sphere moves in the wind, are very light. They're all made of thin metal. The sphere, as you can see, seemed to be floating in the air. Of course, the structure was quite robust, and they had to use cable stays and suspension cables, but especially in the evening, at night, it looked like the sphere was floating in the air. The lighting design and the movement was accompanied with the Lev Theremin's soundtrack, composed specifically for this work. This work was created because Viacheslav Koleychuk meticulously studied the heritage of the Russian avant-garde, especially the heritage of constructivists, whom he admired, whom he studied. And it was no accident that it was Koleychuk who was approached by Georgy Kostaki, a famous collector who collected avant-garde pieces, to reconstruct one of the mobiles by Alexander Rodchenko. Koleychuk did that, if I'm not mistaken, in 1968. All of you who attended the Tretyakov Gallery, you might have seen this hall, which is a reconstruction of the exhibition of the Society of Young Artists, 1921. But unless you read the labels, you don't know that one of the authors of this show is Koleychuk, who meticulously studied the heritage of early constructivism. It was he who studied the philosophy of these items and managed to recreate him. One has to say that Viacheslav Koleychuk was very much inspired by the heritage, but he kept looking for new forms, and he had an engineering talent. He could actually calculate and recreate the ideas that came to his mind. He also loved studying the history of architecture. By the way, he was employed at the Institute of the History and Theory of Architecture. It was his job. Later on, he worked at the Soviet Institute of Architectural Aesthetics and had dedicated all of his time to researching the heritage of different art areas. In the 90s, he wrote a book on kinetists, and in the academic scene, he was the only person, I think, who managed to connect the past and the present, and who could lay out the meanings of different solutions that these artists came up with. In his impossible objects, for example, he creates 3D mock-ups of an impossible image. Here you can see it executed in wood. His works demonstrate the reality of illusion. I think it was his biggest talent. I remember him speaking on television. He was giving a commentary on how it is possible that he called this work of 1976 a standing thread, and it indeed does not have any support and does not have any core in the middle. This structure is so well thought through that the pieces that come together in it manage to balance, manage to be in equilibrium. To the audience, his works looked like a miracle. He worked a lot with different structures. He also patented many engineering solutions that were in demand in the space industry and in other industries too. He created a lot of pieces that he called self-stress structures, and later on he also produced music instruments. The item you see on the screen is called sound self-stressed structure. One could interact with the metal strings and with the pipes, and depending on the place you touched, it could produce different sounds. Viacheslav Koleychuk was exploring music instruments just as much as he explored functional items, functional pieces, and optical illusions. As I said before, geometric abstraction and kinetism in the Soviet culture, quite unexpectedly, were more accepted by the Soviet authorities, by the Soviet power, unlike pure conceptualism. In 1979, on Malaya Gruzinskaya Street, public saw the exhibition titled Color, Form, and Space, and what you can see is the Möbius strip, is the self-stressed structures, the impossible object number 1, and many other objects by Viacheslav Koleychuk. By then, they became part of the history of Russian contemporary art. Viacheslav Koleychuk was very different from everybody else. He was unequaled in his engineering abilities. He managed to design and to execute huge mobiles, huge moving objects. By the way, here in the middle, you can see a model created along the same principle as the sphere for the atom exhibition, which we saw before. And I also wanted to say that Koleychuk was far from creating only functional objects. And it was not about spectacular structures only. He also did set design, for example, many objects for Kinzadza by Danelia were designed by Koleychuk precisely. In 2017, for the Transatlantic Alternative Exhibition, the Garage Museum of Contemporary Art recreated the atom object. It was installed right behind these walls. The artist helped us design the structure, but unfortunately he did not live to see the opening of the exhibition. However, in our space, in the space of the post-Soviet culture, the art of Viacheslav Koleychuk and the art of Francisco Infante is not just historical material that we need to research. It is also a sample about how an artist can think contemporaneity despite external circumstances, the resistance of the environment around himself or herself. This is it for today. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm ready to take your questions. Okay, if there are no questions, then we're going to have our next session on the 16th of May. See you then. Thank you.